Swing low. O chariot swing coming for to carry me home. Swing low sweet chariot. The promise of freedom in 1865. In the spring of 1865, following 4 years of bloody conflict, the Civil War concluded with a Union victory. Across the United States, enslaved men and women waited with anxiety for the meaning of freedom to reach their towns and their homes. In Louisville, Kentucky, the announcement of abolition stirred emotions of disbelief and joy. Families who had been separated by forced labor and auctions now dreamed of reunion. The promise of liberty was about not only leaving chains behind, but also about building new lives with dignity, wages, and land. Yet, the word freedom was fragile in Kentucky. Unlike in the deep South states, slavery had been deeply rooted in urban households and rural farms. The economy of Louisville depended on manufacturing, warehouses, and river trade, where enslaved labor was common. Many African Americans expected to be treated as free citizens, but local power structures resisted. Former slaveholders, who had lost their authority and wealth, sought to keep control through manipulation and intimidation. For the freed population, the war's end was only the beginning of another struggle, to claim rights that were written on paper but not yet respected in daily life. Louisville's fragile transition. By 1867, Louisville stood as a city of contradictions. Its streets bustled with riverboats on the Ohio River, transporting people and goods, while tobacco factories and brick warehouses offered new jobs. On the surface, Louisville looked prosperous, growing, and modern. But underneath, racial tensions ran deep. The city was filled with hostility and hope as thousands of freed people tried to carve out a future. The transition from slavery to freedom was fragile. White employers often refused to pay fair wages or used debt contracts to bind workers, creating conditions not far from slavery. Courts and police patrols favored white citizens, rarely protecting black families. Reports of violence against freed men circulated, and night riders threatened those who dared to demand justice. For women like Patsy Minkins, who had been enslaved in Louisville households, freedom meant continuing to serve under the same roofs where she had once been considered property. Churches and schools began to appear, organized by African American communities determined to rise despite resistance. In basements of wooden chapels or rented halls downtown, lessons in writing and reading took place at night. Louisville's fragile transition revealed betrayal and progress. While the city advertised itself as part of a new America, many of its black citizens remained trapped in old chains disguised under new names. Patsy Minkins' early life. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. Patsy Minkins was born into bondage in Louisville, Kentucky in the years before the Civil War. Like many enslaved children in urban households, her earliest memories were tied to laundry rooms, kitchens, and small servant quarters behind brick homes. Louisville was not a plantation town in the traditional sense, but slavery was everywhere, inside wealthy families' houses, in tobacco warehouses, and on riverfront docks. Patsy likely grew up watching her mother perform endless tasks for white employers, always under strict surveillance. Childhood was short. By the time she was old enough to sweep floors or carry buckets, she became part of the household labor force. Urban slavery was different from the vast cotton fields of Alabama or Mississippi. Enslaved women and men in Louisville often lived closer to their enslavers, sleeping in attics or small outbuildings. They cleaned, cooked, cared for children, and sometimes worked in local markets, but they had no rights or wages. Patsy's young life was shaped by obedience and silence, enforced by fear of punishment. Still, she would have found moments of connection with other enslaved people in the city. Whispered prayers, shared songs, and secret gatherings created a fragile sense of community. By 1865, when the war ended, Patsy was still young, but already carried the heavy scars of enslavement. For her, the promise of freedom seemed close. Yet, the chains of daily reality had not been lifted. The illusion of abolition. In theory, by 1865, slavery was abolished across the United States. The 13th Amendment had declared it illegal to hold people as property. But in Kentucky, where local traditions and laws still favored slaveholders, the reality was far more complex. For women like Patsy Minkins, the announcement of freedom did not bring an immediate change. Instead, she remained in the same household where she had been enslaved, expected to serve as before. Former masters and employers often insisted that young black women owed them years of labor, claiming apprenticeships or false contracts that were never freely agreed upon. This illusion of abolition was sustained by manipulation and fear. Many freed people could not write or read, making it easy for employers and courts to trap them in fraudulent agreements. Local judges and sheriffs, who often sympathized with white property owners, turned a blind eye. Louisville's newspapers reported freedom, but in workshops, stables, and kitchens, the old rules of domination continued. For Patsy, daily life after abolition may have looked almost identical to life before. She woke early, worked long hours, and endured constant supervision. The difference was only on paper. Freedom existed in law, but not in practice. Her situation reflects the painful truth of Reconstruction-era Kentucky. Liberty was proclaimed, but justice was delayed, leaving thousands of African Americans trapped in bondage long after the nation celebrated emancipation. Hidden bondage in the city. By 1867, Louisville presented itself as a free city under the Union flag. But the reality for many African Americans was hidden bondage. While the public celebrated progress, thousands of freed people remained trapped in systems that echoed slavery. Women like Patsy Minkins, who had once been enslaved in city households, were told they must continue working without pay. Employers used deceptive contracts or claimed guardianship over younger black women, forcing them to remain in service against their will. These arrangements were rarely challenged because the courts in Kentucky were dominated by men who sympathized with white property owners. Louisville's urban environment created unique forms of control. On the busy streets near the Ohio River, black workers carried heavy loads, cleaned taverns, and served food. Yet, many were never paid. Instead, they were threatened with violence or jail if they refused. City jails became another tool of coercion. African Americans accused of vagrancy or disobedience were arrested and then leased out to local businesses, echoing the slavery system in everything but name. For Patsy, this meant that even after the war's end, she still lived under constant supervision. Her days were filled with labor inside households, caring for children who would one day inherit the wealth built on her unpaid work. At night, she may have wondered if freedom was ever truly real. Hidden bondage ensured that many in Louisville remained chained not by law but by the power of injustice, poverty, and intimidation. Resistance and survival. Despite the crushing weight of oppression, African Americans like Patsy Minkins found ways to survive and resist. Resistance in Louisville did not always mean open rebellion. Instead, it took the form of quiet acts of defiance, sharing food with neighbors, delaying work, or secretly teaching each other to read. These daily choices allowed people to maintain dignity in a world determined to strip it away. Patsy, like many young women, learned to protect herself with silence in front of white employers, but strength in private with her community. Survival also depended on networks of trust. Families who had been separated during slavery worked tirelessly to reunite. In Louisville, groups of freed people gathered at river docks, hoping to find loved ones who had been sold south before the war. Churches provided both physical and spiritual refuge. Inside wooden chapels, songs of freedom carried messages of endurance. Faith became a powerful weapon against despair. For women like Patsy, survival also meant using their skills. Cooking, sewing, and child care could sometimes be turned into paid work, though employers often underpaid or cheated them. Still, every coin earned was a step toward independence. Resisting did not always bring immediate results, but it preserved hope. By refusing to give up their humanity, freed people planted seeds for future generations. Patsy's survival was not only her own. It was part of a larger struggle in which every act of endurance pushed back against the system of bondage that refused to die in post-war Kentucky. Community and church networks. In the years following the Civil War, black churches became the heart of resistance and survival in Louisville. For people like Patsy Minkins, these sacred spaces were more than places of worship. They served as community centers, classrooms, and meeting halls where freed people could gather without constant white supervision. Churches such as small Methodist and Baptist congregations began to appear in rented storefronts, wooden buildings, and even private homes. Here, African Americans shared news, reunited families, and organized schools for adults and children alike. Education was a central mission. Volunteers and teachers, sometimes freedmen themselves or sympathetic Northerners, offered lessons in writing and reading. For a woman like Patty, who had grown up in bondage and likely never held a book as a child, the chance to learn letters was revolutionary. Literacy meant a tool to navigate a world that had long denied her humanity and protection from fraudulent contracts. These networks also offered emotional strength. In a city where white employers and patrols still controlled daily life, church gatherings gave African Americans a sense of independence and belonging. They sang spirituals that carried the hope of liberation and the memory of slavery. They pooled resources to help widows buy land or defend community members in court. For Patty, being part of this network meant knowing she was not alone. Even if her days were filled with surveillance and labor, the evenings spent among her people provided courage. Churches became symbols of a new future, determined but fragile, where freedom slowly took root in the soil of Louisville. Confrontation with authorities. As freed people in Louisville began to assert their rights and organize, confrontations with authorities became unavoidable. For women like Patsy Minkins, whose very existence challenged the old order, the police and courts often represented danger rather than protection. Sheriffs and judges in Kentucky were almost always white men who sympathized with former slaveholders. When African Americans tried to challenge illegal bondage, their cases were often overturned, delayed, or dismissed. The law was written to promise freedom, but in practice it was applied unevenly, leaving people like Patty with little hope for justice. Still, there were moments when freed people pushed their cases forward. Some men and women testified before local courts, describing how they were held under false contracts or forced to work without pay. In these rare public hearings, the courage of individuals was remarkable. Standing in a courtroom surrounded by white hostility, they spoke the truth of continued slavery. For Patty, even the thought of bringing her situation into court carried immense risk. Speaking out could mean eviction, retaliation, or worse, violent punishment from those determined to silence her. Authorities also controlled freedom through vagrancy laws, which allowed police to arrest African Americans for being unemployed or simply walking at night without papers. Those arrested were sent to city jails and then leased out to businesses, recreating slavery under another name. This system blurred the line between justice and oppression, ensuring that black freedom was fragile. Patty's story reflects how deeply Reconstruction failed in places like Kentucky, where the promise of liberty clashed with the harsh reality of institutions determined to preserve the old order. The weight of silence. For decades after emancipation, the story of people like Patsy Minkins was buried beneath layers of silence. Louisville, like much of Kentucky, preferred to tell a version of history that celebrated progress while ignoring the persistence of bondage after 1865. Local newspapers rarely reported the truth of continued servitude, and white families who had once enslaved people erased these details from their family records. This silence was not accidental. It was a deliberate choice to maintain the illusion that slavery had ended cleanly with the war and to protect reputations. For African Americans, silence often came from necessity rather than denial. Speaking too openly about mistreatment could bring violence, loss of work, or retaliation. Women like Patty, who remained trapped in households after abolition, carried their pain quietly. Their daily survival required obedience in public, even as they whispered the truth in trusted company. Stories of hidden bondage were passed down in fragments. A grandmother telling her granddaughter how she worked without wages, or a neighbor recalling the fear of night patrols long after the war. This silence shaped memory for generations. Without public acknowledgement, the reality of post-war slavery faded from Kentucky's collective history. Schoolbooks celebrated freedom but omitted the struggles of those left behind. Patty's experience reminds us that the absence of testimony does not mean absence of suffering. Her bondage after abolition is evidence of how power can erase voices. Breaking that silence today means restoring her story, giving recognition to lives that were denied justice, and challenging the myths that once concealed their pain. Remembering Patsy Minkins. To remember Patsy Minkins is to confront one of the most difficult truths of American history. that freedom did not arrive at the same time for all. In Louisville in 1867, she remained in bondage even after the nation had declared slavery abolished. Her life represents the many unnamed women and men who continue to endure forced labor under new disguises. Remembering her today is an act of justice, a way of ensuring her suffering is not forgotten. Her story teaches us that emancipation was not a single event, but a long struggle, often betrayed and uneven. For Patty, the promise of liberty was delayed by a society unwilling to let go of its old order. Yet by surviving, by holding on to her dignity, she became part of a broader legacy of endurance. Her labor, her silence, and her quiet acts of resistance carried meaning even when history chose not to record them. Commemorating Patty means giving her voice in places where it was once denied. It means telling her story in community gatherings, documentaries, and classrooms. It means recognizing Louisville not only for its growth and commerce, but also for the hidden chains that bound women like her after the war. Remembering Patsy Minkins challenges us to see beyond the official timelines, to honor the resilience of those who lived in the shadow of broken promises. Her name stands as a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied and that memory itself can become a form of liberation.